Waitress refused to serve veteran, unaware the undercover owner was sitting behind. John Harper stood in front of his computer screen, his weathered hands gripping the edge of his desk as he read yet another one-star review. The words seemed to blur together, but their meaning was crystal clear. Harper's Diner was failing. Food was cold, service was horrible, and the waitress acted like we were bothering her by being there. Don't waste your time or money. The review, posted just hours ago, was the 5th negative one this week. John ran his fingers through his salt and pepper hair, the familiar weight of responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. Harper's Diner had been his dream, his salvation after returning from the military. For 15 years, it had been the heart of the community, a place where families gathered, where stories were shared over steaming cups of coffee, and where veterans like himself could find a moment of peace. But lately, something had changed. The warm, welcoming atmosphere he'd worked so hard to create was disappearing, replaced by complaints about cold food, rude service, and an overall decline in quality. The morning rush, once a bustling symphony of clinking plates and friendly chatter, had dwindled to a handful of loyal customers. "Everything all right, boss?" Maria, his head chef of 12 years, poked her head into his office. The concern in her voice was evident, matching the worry lines that had deepened on her face over the past few weeks. John minimized the review page and forced a smile. "Just checking the numbers, Maria. How's the kitchen holding up?" "Doing our best," she replied, wiping her hands on her apron. "But John, these new servers, they're not like the old crew. Yesterday, I had 3 plates sitting under the heat lamp for 10 minutes before anyone picked them up. And the complaints?" She didn't need to finish. John had heard enough complaints to last a lifetime. The problem wasn't the food. Maria's cooking was as excellent as ever. The issue lay somewhere between the kitchen and the customers, in that crucial interaction that could make or break a dining experience. Later that evening, after the dinner rush had subsided, John sat in his office reviewing the staff files. Most of his veteran employees had moved on over the past year: retirement, relocations, better opportunities. Their replacements were younger, less experienced, and seemed to lack the personal investment in the diner's success that had once been its hallmark. As he flipped through the files, his eyes landed on a particular incident report from last week. A customer had complained about being ignored for 20 minutes, only to watch the server chat with her friends at another table. The server's explanation? They're regulars. That was when the idea struck him. John leaned back in his chair, his military training kicking in. Sometimes, the best way to assess a situation wasn't from above, but from ground level. He needed to see exactly what was happening in his diner through the eyes of a customer. Opening his desk drawer, John pulled out an old baseball cap he kept there, a remnant from his son's Little League days. He hadn't done undercover work since his military days, but some skills never really fade. The next day, he would come in not as the owner, but as just another customer. That night, as John locked up the diner, he stood for a moment under the flickering neon sign that bore his family name. The H in Harper's buzzed intermittently, creating an odd, Morse code-like pattern against the darkening sky. He remembered the day he'd first turned on that sign, how proud he'd been to create a place that represented everything he believed in: good food, respect for others, and a sense of community. "Time to fix this," he muttered to himself, pocketing his keys. Tomorrow, he would see firsthand what was really happening in his diner. No filters, no sugarcoating, no employees on their best behavior because the boss was watching. Just the raw, unvarnished truth about what Harper's Diner had become. As he walked to his car, John couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow would bring more than just answers. In his experience, both in the military and in business, when you go looking for the truth, you often find more than you bargain for. But that's exactly what he needed, the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. Little did he know, the next day would test not just his patience as an owner, but his humanity as a veteran, and force him to confront a situation he never could have anticipated. The truth he was seeking would come at a price, and it would change Harper's Diner forever. Olivia Matthews adjusted her name tag in the employee bathroom mirror, making sure it sat perfectly straight on her crisp uniform. 3 weeks into her job at Harper's Diner, and she still couldn't shake the feeling that she had something to prove. At 24, she was the newest hire, and the weight of that status pressed down on her shoulders every time she stepped onto the floor. The morning rush was about to begin, but her mind kept drifting back to last Thursday's incident. The memory of it made her cheeks burn with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. That customer, Nathaniel Foster, had sat in her section, ordered a simple breakfast, and then proceeded to tear apart everything about her service in front of other customers. "Ma'am," he had said, his voice carrying across 3 tables, "the eggs are overcooked, the toast is cold, and I've been waiting for a coffee refill for 15 minutes while you've been chatting with table 7. The way he'd emphasized ma'am made it sound like an insult rather than a courtesy. Olivia gripped the edge of the bathroom sink, her knuckles turning white. What made it worse was that he came in regularly, always sitting in her section, always finding something to criticize. The coffee was too weak, the service too slow, the menu prices too high for the quality. It felt personal, like he was targeting her specifically. "Hey, Liv!" Sarah, another waitress, poked her head into the bathroom. "You okay? We've got customers waiting." Olivia nodded, straightening her shoulders. "Coming. Just freshening up." As she pushed through the swinging doors into the dining area, she overheard 2 regular customers discussing Nate Foster in hushed tones. "That's the veteran who always sits in the corner booth," one whispered to her friend. "I heard he served 3 tours overseas." "Well, military service doesn't give anyone the right to be rude to wait staff," her companion replied. The words strengthened Olivia's resolve. She was tired of being the target of his criticism, veteran or not. Every time he walked in, her anxiety spiked. Her hands would shake as she poured his coffee, knowing he was watching, waiting for her to make a mistake he could point out. Last week, she'd overheard him talking to another veteran at his table about how standards had slipped at Harper's. "This place used to mean something," he'd said, shaking his head. "Now they hire kids who don't understand the value of real service." That comment had stung the most. Olivia had worked her way through community college waiting tables, supporting herself when her family couldn't. She understood service better than most, but something about Nate Foster made her feel like an amateur, like everything she did was wrong. During her break, Olivia sat in the staff room, scrolling through the diner's online reviews. There it was, a review from NF, posted 3 days ago. "Used to be the best place in town. Now it's just another mediocre diner with undertrained staff. Disappointing to see how far it's fallen." She knew it was from him. The words echoed his frequent complaints, and the initials matched. Each word felt like a personal attack, undermining her confidence and feeding her growing resentment. "Don't let him get to you," Maria had advised from the kitchen when she'd seen Olivia's hands shaking after one of his visits. "Some customers just like to complain." But it wasn't just complaining. To Olivia, it felt like warfare, a constant battle of wills every time he walked through the door. She'd started dreading the morning shifts, knowing he usually came in for breakfast. The sight of his weather-worn jacket and military bearing would send her stomach into knots. As she refilled salt shakers at the end of her shift, Olivia made a decision. She wouldn't let him intimidate her anymore. If he came in again, she would stand her ground. The diner might be struggling, but that didn't give anyone the right to treat the staff like they were beneath them. "Veterans deserve respect," she muttered to herself, arranging the shakers with precise movements. "But so do I." She didn't know then that her decision would set in motion events that would change everything at Harper's Diner. She didn't know that her growing resentment was blinding her to truths she couldn't see, or that her next encounter with Nathaniel Foster would have consequences far beyond a simple server-customer dispute. As she hung up her apron at the end of her shift, Olivia caught a glimpse of her reflection in the chrome napkin dispenser. The face that looked back at her was set with determination, but there was something else there too, a hint of uncertainty in her eyes that suggested that maybe, just maybe, she was letting this situation spiral out of control. The next time Nathaniel Foster walked into Harper's Diner, Olivia Matthews would be ready. She had no way of knowing that her response to his presence would trigger a chain of events that would expose not just her own prejudices, but shake the very foundation of everything she thought she knew about Harper's Diner and its customers. Outside, the sun was setting behind the diner's neon sign, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Tomorrow would bring another day of service, another chance for confrontation, and unknowingly, a moment that would define not just Olivia's future at Harper's, but the future of the diner itself. The Wednesday afternoon lull had settled over Harper's Diner like a comfortable blanket. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, creating patterns on the checkered floor tiles. The lunch rush had ended, leaving behind the gentle hum of ceiling fans and the occasional clink of coffee cups against saucers. Olivia was restocking the napkin dispensers when the bell above the door chimed. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. The measured footsteps and the slight scrape of boots against the welcome mat told her everything. Nathaniel Foster had returned. The afternoon sun caught his military bearing as he stood in the doorway, casting a long shadow across the diner floor. He wore his usual weathered leather jacket despite the warm spring day, his silver hair neatly combed, posture straight as an arrow. To any other observer, he might have looked like just another customer seeking a late lunch, but to Olivia, his presence felt like a storm cloud rolling in. In the corner booth, obscured by the day's newspaper, John Harper shifted slightly in his seat. He'd been there for hours, watching the ebb and flow of customers, taking mental notes about service patterns and staff interactions. His baseball cap was pulled low, and his usual clean-shaven face now carried a day's worth of stubble, enough to make him unrecognizable to his employees. Nate Foster moved toward his usual spot, a booth by the window with a clear view of both the entrance and the kitchen. It was a habit many veterans developed, Olivia had noticed, always wanting to be aware of their surroundings. Today, however, that booth was occupied by a young family with 2 small children. As Foster approached her station, Olivia felt her heart rate quicken. The memory of his previous criticisms burned fresh in her mind, fueling a surge of defensive anger. Before he could even open his mouth to speak, she made her decision. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her voice carrying a forced politeness that barely masked her underlying tension. "We're not taking any more orders at the moment." Foster glanced around the half-empty diner, his expression puzzled. Through the kitchen window, Maria could be seen preparing a fresh batch of meatloaf, and the coffee maker gurgled as it brewed a fresh pot. "Not taking orders?" he questioned, his voice level but confused. "The sign says you're open until 9. Olivia straightened her spine, channeling all her frustration into a mask of professional detachment. "We're experiencing some kitchen issues at the moment. Perhaps you'd like to try the diner across town?" In his corner booth, John Harper lowered his newspaper slightly, his eyes narrowing as he watched the scene unfold. He'd known Nate Foster for years, had served with him in situations that forged bonds stronger than steel. Seeing him being turned away from the very establishment that was meant to be a haven for veterans made his blood boil, but he forced himself to remain seated, to watch how this would play out. Foster's weathered face showed a flicker of understanding, not of the situation, but of the underlying message. He'd seen enough conflict in his life to recognize when someone had drawn a line in the sand. His eyes scanned Olivia's face, taking in her defensive posture and the slight tremor in her hands. "Kitchen issues," he repeated slowly, as if testing the weight of the lie. "I see." His voice carried years of command experience, but also a weariness that spoke of battles chosen and battles abandoned. A young couple walked in at that moment, and Olivia immediately turned to greet them with a bright smile. "Table for 2? Right this way, please." The contrast was stark and deliberate. Foster stood there for a moment longer, his presence like a stone in a stream as other customers flowed around him. Finally, he nodded, a short, military gesture that carried both acknowledgement and resignation. "Thank you for your time," he said formally, each word measured and precise. As he turned to leave, the fluorescent lights caught the small Vietnam veteran pin on his jacket lapel, making it glint briefly. The bell chimed again as Foster walked out, its cheerful tone now seeming somehow discordant. Olivia felt a surge of triumph mixed with an undercurrent of something else, something that felt uncomfortably like shame. She pushed the feeling aside, focusing instead on the satisfaction of having finally stood her ground. In his booth, John Harper carefully folded his newspaper, his movements controlled and deliberate. The coffee in his cup had gone cold, forgotten in the wake of what he'd just witnessed. He'd seen enough, more than enough. His weathered hands, the same hands that had once pulled Nate Foster to safety under heavy fire, curled into fists beneath the table. Through the large front windows, he watched as his old friend walked to his truck, spine straight despite the rejection he'd just faced. The same man who had once carried John 3 miles through enemy territory with a bullet in his own leg was being turned away from a meal because of one server's prejudice. The afternoon sun continued to paint patterns on the diner floor, the ceiling fans kept turning, and customers continued their meals, unaware of the significance of what had just transpired. But in that moment, something fundamental had shifted in Harper's diner. Lines had been drawn, judgments had been made, and consequences were about to unfold. As Olivia returned to her tasks, humming softly to herself, she remained unaware that her small act of defiance had been witnessed by the one person who could truly understand its significance. She didn't know that the quiet man in the corner booth was about to stand up and set in motion events that would shake her world to its foundations. John Harper sat motionless in his booth, the folded newspaper trembling slightly in his hands. The scene he had just witnessed had awakened something in him, a mixture of anger and disappointment that ran deeper than mere business concerns. His mind flashed back to a different time, a different place, where he and Nate had faced far graver situations together. Kandahar Province, 2005. The air thick with dust and gunfire. Nate Foster had dragged him to safety after an IED blast, ignoring his own shrapnel wounds. They'd spent 18 hours behind enemy lines, Nate keeping him conscious by talking about his dream of opening a restaurant when he got home. "Every veteran needs a place to belong," Nate had said, applying pressure to John's wounds. "Somewhere they can feel at home." Now, watching through the window as Nate's truck pulled out of the parking lot, John felt the weight of that memory press against his chest. Harper's Diner had been born from those conversations, from the promise of creating a haven for veterans and civilians alike. And he had just watched that promise being broken by someone who had no idea what it meant. From his vantage point, John observed Olivia's demeanor change as she served other customers. Her smile returned, her steps lightened, as if removing Nate from the equation had lifted a burden from her shoulders. She had no idea that her actions had just shattered years of trust and friendship. The coffee cup before him had grown cold, but John barely noticed. His military training kicked in as he analyzed the situation, not as a restaurant owner, but as a soldier assessing a threat to his unit. The threat here wasn't external, it was internal, a cancer of prejudice and misunderstanding that had taken root in his own establishment. He watched as Olivia chatted easily with other customers, her previous tension completely gone. A family with young children occupied Nate's usual booth, the kids coloring on their placemats while their parents studied the menu. The scene should have been heartwarming, but all John could see was the absence of his friend, turned away from the very place that should have welcomed him. Through the kitchen window, he caught glimpses of Maria preparing meals, unaware of what had transpired. The veteran chef had worked alongside both him and Nate for years, understanding the deeper purpose of Harper's Diner. She would be devastated to learn about this incident. John's fingers traced the edge of his coffee cup, remembering countless morning briefings shared with Nate in this very diner. They'd discussed everything from menu changes to their combat experiences, building a friendship that went far beyond customer and owner. Now, that same friend had been treated like an unwelcome intruder. The afternoon light began to shift, casting longer shadows across the diner floor. John noticed how Olivia efficiently moved between tables, her service impeccable for the customers she deemed worthy. Her competence only made her earlier behavior more troubling. This wasn't about inability, but choice. A group of teenagers entered, filling the air with laughter and chatter. Olivia welcomed them warmly, quickly arranging tables to accommodate their group. The contrast between this welcome and Nate's rejection made John's jaw clench. His hand moved unconsciously to his chest, where his own service medals lay hidden beneath his civilian clothes. He thought about the reviews he'd been reading earlier, the complaints about service. Now he understood. The problem wasn't universal poor service, but selective service. Some customers were deemed worthy of attention and respect, while others, like Nate, were treated as inconveniences to be removed. As he watched, John's anger transformed into something more focused, more purposeful. This wasn't just about one incident or one employee. This was about the soul of Harper's Diner, about keeping the promises he'd made in those desperate hours in Kandahar. Promises sealed in blood and brotherhood. The baseball cap he wore felt heavy now, like the helmet he'd once worn in combat. He knew what needed to be done, but timing was crucial. In the military, they'd learned that the moment of engagement was just as important as the action itself. He needed to address this situation in a way that would not just correct the immediate problem, but ensure it never happened again. Through the large windows, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. The same colors he and Nate had watched countless times during their tours of duty, wondering if they'd make it home. They had survived those sunsets together, protected each other, fought for each other. And now, in the supposed safety of home, he had witnessed his brother-in-arms being turned away from the very sanctuary they had dreamed of creating. John's reflection in the window caught his eye, the baseball cap, the day-old stubble, the civilian clothes that masked the soldier beneath. He had come here to understand why his diner was failing, but he'd discovered something far more critical. It wasn't just the service that was failing, it was the very principles upon which Harper's Diner had been built. The time for observation was over. As more customers filed in for the approaching dinner rush, John knew the moment to act had arrived. He watched Olivia move confidently between tables, still unaware that her actions had been witnessed by the one person who understood their true significance. His decision was made. The undercover operation had served its purpose, revealing a truth more disturbing than any bad review could convey. Now it was time for John Harper, owner and veteran, to emerge from the shadows and confront not just an employee's bias, but the betrayal of everything Harper's Diner stood for. The dinner rush was beginning to pick up when John Harper finally rose from his booth. He removed his baseball cap with deliberate slowness, his movements drawing no attention from the bustling dinner crowd. The transformation from anonymous customer to owner was subtle but profound, his posture straightening, his eyes hardening with military precision. Olivia was behind the counter, organizing receipts and humming to herself, still riding the wave of satisfaction from her earlier confrontation. The sound of measured footsteps approaching made her look up, customer service smile at the ready. The smile froze on her face as recognition dawned. "Mr. Harper?" she stammered, her hands instinctively clutching the stack of receipts closer to her chest. I didn't know you were here today." "No." John's voice was quiet but carried the weight of command that years in the military had instilled. "You didn't." The dinner crowd's chatter seemed to fade into the background as he fixed her with a steady gaze. "We need to talk about what just happened with Mr. Foster." The color drained from Olivia's face as realization struck. Her eyes darted to the corner booth where she'd seen a man sitting all afternoon, hidden behind a newspaper. "You were," she began, but her voice trailed off. "In the corner booth," John confirmed, his voice still measured but carrying an undercurrent of controlled anger. "I saw everything, Olivia. Every single thing." Maria emerged from the kitchen, sensing the tension in the air. She took one look at John's face and immediately understood something serious was happening. Without a word, she gestured to Sarah, another waitress, to take over Olivia's section. "My office. Now." John's words weren't loud, but they carried the same authority that had once commanded troops in combat zones. Olivia followed him, her legs feeling like lead as they walked past curious customers and concerned coworkers. The office was small but neat, with military certificates and old photographs lining the walls. John closed the door behind them, the soft click seeming to echo in the tense silence. He didn't sit behind his desk but instead remained standing, his presence filling the small space. Do you know what you did out there? He asked, his voice containing not just anger, but a deep disappointment that cut through Olivia's defenses. Do you understand the magnitude of your actions? Olivia straightened her spine, grasping for the righteous indignation that had fueled her earlier. Mr. Harper, if this is about Mr. Foster, I can explain. He's been consistently critical of our service, leaving negative reviews, making comments about the staff. I was simply refusing service to a decorated war veteran. John cut her off, his voice sharp. A man who has sacrificed more for this country than you could possibly understand. He moved to one of the photographs on the wall, showing two younger men in military uniform, arms around each other's shoulders, desert sand and military vehicles in the background. This was taken in Kandahar, John said, his voice taking on a different tone. That's me on the left. And that man you just turned away? That's him on the right. The same man who carried me 3 miles through enemy territory with a bullet in his own leg to get me to safety. Olivia's eyes widened as she looked at the photograph, seeing the younger versions of her boss and the customers she'd just rejected. The realization of what she'd done began to sink in, her carefully constructed justifications crumbling. But his complaints? She began weakly. His complaints? John turned back to her, his eyes blazing. Nate Foster has earned the right to every single one of those complaints. Do you know why he's so particular about service? Because he understands better than most what service truly means. It's not just about bringing coffee or taking orders, Olivia. It's about respect, dignity, and treating every person who walks through that door like they matter. He moved to his desk, pulling out a folder. These are the original plans for Harper's Diner. Do you know what it says on the first page? A place where everyone belongs. That was the promise I made to myself and to Nate when I opened this place. A promise you broke today with your actions. Olivia felt tears welling up in her eyes as the full weight of her actions began to sink in. I didn't know, she whispered. No, you didn't know, John agreed, his voice softening slightly. But that's exactly the problem. You didn't try to know. You made assumptions, let your pride cloud your judgment, and forgot the fundamental principle of what service means. The distant sounds of the dinner service filtered through the office walls, clinking plates, murmured conversations, the normal sounds of the diner continuing as if nothing had changed. But in that small office, everything had changed. Mr. Harper, I'm so sorry, Olivia began, but John held up his hand. I'm not the one you need to apologize to, he said firmly. And we're not done here. There's something else you need to understand about Nate Foster, something that makes your actions today even more significant. He moved toward the door, his hand resting on the handle. It's time you learn the full story of Harper's Diner and the man you just turned away. John moved to the wall of his office where a framed document hung slightly askew. He straightened it, revealing the original deed to Harper's Diner. 2 names were listed as co-owners, John Harper and Nathaniel Foster. This diner, John began, his voice softening with emotion, was never just mine. Nate and I planned it together during our darkest days in combat. He invested his entire military pension into making this dream a reality. Olivia's legs wobbled, and she sank into the chair behind her. Co-owner? She whispered, the word barely audible. When we returned home, both of us struggled with civilian life. John continued, pulling another photograph from his desk drawer. Nate suggested creating a place where veterans could feel at home, where they could find the same sense of belonging we had in our unit. But he wanted it to be more than that, a bridge between military and civilian life. The photograph showed the diner's opening day, with both men proudly standing beneath the newly installed sign. Their faces were younger, but their expressions held the same determined look that came from surviving combat together. Every criticism Nate made was because he cares deeply about this place. His high standards weren't personal attacks. They were attempts to maintain the excellence we promised each other we'd deliver. John's voice carried a mixture of pride and sadness. He's been testing our service, not as a difficult customer, but as an owner ensuring we stay true to our mission. Tears streamed down Olivia's face as the full impact of her actions hit her. All this time, I thought he was just a complaining customer. I had no idea. There's more, John said, sitting on the edge of his desk. 2 months ago, Nate was diagnosed with cancer. Stage 4. His doctors have given him less than a year. The words hung heavy in the air. He's been coming in more frequently because he wants to make sure the diner will maintain its standards after he's gone. Every complaint, every suggestion, it's his way of trying to leave a lasting legacy. A sob escaped Olivia's throat as she covered her mouth with her hands. The man she had turned away wasn't just a veteran or a co-owner. He was a dying man trying to protect something he loved. I'm not telling you this to make you feel worse, John said gently. I'm telling you because you need to understand what service truly means. It's not just about the food or the coffee, it's about dignity, respect, and creating a place where everyone belongs. Standing up, John walked to the office door. The question now is, what are you going to do with this knowledge? Olivia wiped her eyes and stood up, her posture straightening with newfound purpose. I want to make this right, she said firmly. Please let me try to fix this. John nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. That's what I hoped you'd say. Nate's having treatment tomorrow morning at the VA hospital. He usually stops by the diner afterward, around 2. Will you be ready? The next afternoon, when Nate Foster walked through the door of Harper's Diner, he found his usual booth waiting. The table was set with precision, a fresh cup of coffee already steaming beside a plate of his favorite apple pie. Olivia stood beside the table, her eyes red but her smile genuine. Mr. Foster, she said, her voice steady despite her emotions, I owe you the deepest apology. Would you please join me for a moment? Nate glanced at John, who stood nearby, and received an encouraging nod. As he sat down, Olivia placed a handwritten letter beside his coffee cup. I've written everything I want to say, but the most important thing is this: thank you. Thank you for your service, both to our country and to this diner. Thank you for maintaining the standards that make this place special. And most of all, thank you for giving me the chance to learn and grow from my mistakes. Nate picked up the letter, his weathered hands trembling slightly. As he read, Olivia continued to speak, her voice growing stronger with each word. I've started a new program at the diner, she explained. Every week, we'll host a veterans circle where service members can share their stories with the staff. I want to ensure that what happened yesterday never happens again, not to you, not to anyone. John watched as his old friend's eyes grew misty. Nate carefully folded the letter and looked up at Olivia, his stern expression softening. Pull up a chair, he said, gesturing to the empty seat across from him. Let me tell you about the day John and I first dreamed up this place. As Olivia sat down, other staff members gathered nearby, drawn by the moment. For the next hour, Nate shared stories of friendship, sacrifice, and the dream that became Harper's Diner. His voice grew stronger with each tale, his eyes brighter, as if the simple act of being heard and respected had renewed his spirit. From that day forward, Harper's Diner changed. The Veterans Circle became a beloved tradition, bridging the gap between civilians and service members. Olivia's transformation inspired other staff members, and the diner's reputation for exceptional service was restored. Most importantly, during Nate's final months, he never again felt unwelcome in the place he had helped create. Instead, he watched with pride as his legacy grew stronger, knowing that the values he and John had fought to preserve would live on long after he was gone. And on quiet afternoons, when the sunlight streamed through the windows just right, you could still find Nate in his usual booth, sharing stories with Olivia and the staff, teaching them that true service is about more than just serving food, it's about serving humanity with dignity, respect, and understanding.